A new challenger steps forward to run against Republican Mayor Kevin Faulconer, but she's not a Democrat. The Porter Ranch gas leak is slowing down but still wreaking havoc on the environment. And the state is looking into Hubbs-SeaWorld's experimental fish farm, which produces many deformed fish. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, a reporter Liam Dillon of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Liam.
Hi, Mark.
Good to see you back again. Reporter Ingrid Lobet of iNewsSource. Hi, Ingrid.
Hi, Mark.
Good to have you here today. And reporter Ry Rivard of Voice of San Diego.
Hello,
Hi,
Mark.
Ry. Good to see you. It's a lot. Voice of San Diego here today. That's great. A challenger has finally emerged to run against Republican Mayor Kevin Faulconer less than 6 months before the June primary. Lori Saldana is a liberal, but she's not a Democrat anymore. Her chances appear slim, and she talked about that at her announcement yesterday.
For those who ask if this is a ridiculous quest, I have to tell you that I was the daughter of a career Marine. He taught me that some battles are worth fighting, some challenges are worth taking on, no matter what the odds are. And I love this city very much. And I think fighting for San Diego and a better, brighter future for San Diego is well worth the fight and well worth the challenge that I'm about to undertake.
All right. Well, Liam, give us a little background. Who is Lori Saldana, and why does she want to climb this big political hill?
Sure. Lori Saldana is a former state assemblywoman. She represented an area of the city from roughly 2004 to 2010. She then, and she was at that point a Democrat. She then ran for Congress in 2012 against then Representative Brian Bilbray and Scott Peters, who is the current representative. She finished third in that primary by a very slim margin. And
that's that tough contested district up toward the north part of the city along the coast.
Correct. Yeah, correct. Like La Jolla and those areas.
And a little north of that. Yeah. Okay. All right. And very close. And then she's out. Well, was a Democrat for the longest time, as we said in the open. Right. Why did Saldana leave the party?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both practical and personal reasons. On the practical side, I think what she told me when we spoke is that she's probably more liberal than the mainstream Democrats are. And she says she's been attracted by Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, some of the support that he's getting from the left, and feels like she can engage people who are very progressive and also folks who feel disenfranchised by the political system. There's a growing number of declined estates, people without a political party in San Diego, a really large percentage. And so she feels like she can engage them the same way Sanders has engaged folks. Personally, she's had a number of run-ins with party infrastructure or party establishment in town, most notably during the Bob Filner debacle, and I'm sure we'll discuss this, but she called up the Democratic Party leader in mid-2011 to say, hey, listen, I've heard from some women who have had major problems with Filner. And she argues that was all swept under the rug, and no one took any action about it, which is, mostly true, right? And then Filner, of course, unraveled in the way that he did, and she was, fought against for doing some of that. Similarly, she felt like the party was fighting against her when she was running for Congress, and so all these things put together, and she left the party.
And yet, some Democratic leaders had urged her to step in as a Democrat and run in the mayor's race.
Well, there isn't any. I mean, again, we have the city of plurality Democratic city and no Democratic candidate for mayor. Todd Gloria, city councilman, decided not to run. Tony Atkins, assemblywoman, decided not to run. David Alvarez, he ran before, he decided not to run. So
it was a vacuum, obviously.
Left with nobody.
Yeah. All right, let's get into that a little bit. You touched on that, the Bob Filner situation. It would seem she has some explaining to do, because she went ahead and endorsed Filner even after supposedly back-channeling these issues with the sexual harassment.
Right. It was a very complicated situation, and she referenced this in the interview that she and I had. I called her in 2011 when I was doing a profile on Filner and asked her about some of the rumors that were all out there about his relationship with women and some of the issues, and she would not talk to me at all for that story. And then she called me once some of the harassment allegations came out to say, listen, here's what actually happened, right? And then, and as you said, she endorsed Filner during that campaign. And so all this stuff, and I said, well, you have some explaining to do as well on this issue. And she said, well, I believe this was the first time she had made this public. I'm a survivor, she said, of sexual assault herself. and that was a lot of interesting emotions, and it was difficult for me to deal with it. And now I'm running in part to sort of right some of the wrong that I was involved in.
Ingrid, let me turn it to you for a moment. As a woman, I mean, what do you think potential women voters who would back her and might be liberal would think about all of this? Would that maybe have them stay home or not support her in some way?
Well, I would think somebody would give her credit for being so candid about something that is so difficult to talk about in the public eye. And I was so interested to hear that she said that she thought that there was an epidemic of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And I wondered, did you get an impression of whether she meant locally or at some larger systemic level?
Yeah, we didn't delve into that too much. I'm not sure exactly what she would be, sort of what particular instances she would be referring to with respect to that. But I think,
I mean, politically, of course, we know there is an epidemic. But did she mean in politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing with a lot of the Filner news resurfacing this week in recent times, like, you know, how pervasive some of the stuff was and how deep some of it went. I mean, you know, Filner's former chief of staff wrote a book that we got an advance copy of, talking about how one of his he would literally chase his executive assistant around a conference table, is one of the allegations that she makes in the book. And so this is all sort of under the table for months and months and months until it finally came out. And so these are the kind of things that were going on as recently as 3 years ago in San Diego. I
should do a plug for our evening edition show tonight. She's going to be on and talking about some of those specific Filner allegations. Well, let's shift now back to Saldana. What does she say her main issue is regarding wanting to be mayor of San Diego?
Yeah, I think she's sort of refreshingly candid about what the expectations are for her campaign. I don't think, you know, to be very clear, and although anything can happen, she's not going to win, right? But I think she's very honest, though, about what she wants to do, which is force a conversation in the city about a number of different things. There is, although we haven't heard much about it, a ballot measure on the minimum wage coming up in June. No one's really talking about it. The mayor's opposed. She's very strongly in favor of that.
Liberals want to raise it, yeah.
Absolutely. And so she wants to bring that issue to the forefront. And Faulkner himself has sort of tried to paint a picture of himself as someone who can, as a Republican, reach out to traditionally Democratic constituencies, whether they be people of color and folks like that, saying that sort of he's a softer Republican than what's been seen nationally. But I think she really wants to push him on some of these issues to see sort of how liberal he really is. And I think that's the kind of conversation that she can force for the future.
So maybe kind of a local version of Bernie Sanders to get some of these liberal issues, affordable housing, neglect of the poor, income inequality, a lot of these things that Sanders is talking about nationally.
Yeah.
And so that does kind of talk about some of the differences between Faulkner and Saldana. What about on the Chargers, that big hot button issue, if there's still a hope that they might be here for some people?
Yeah, she did not seem very interested in any sort of deal that would involve taxpayer money.
Public money not going to a football team.
Right, exactly. Although, you know, I will say that anytime anyone is running for office in San Diego, that's their position. But once they're in office, they seem to flip. So I'm certainly not saying that's something she would do, but that's the pattern of every single San Diego politician.
All right, I want to shift gears. We got a few seconds left on this segment. Another political story: Marty Block pulled out of the Democratic primary for the San Diego Senate seat that he has. It paves the way for Assembly Speaker Tony Atkins. A big party fight averted there. Why did Block say he needed to step aside?
Oh, I think, you know, there was a lot of pressure not to have this very damaging and very expensive race happening in the city when there are a lot of more contested races. And it was fascinating to me that we were having this potentially, you know, few $1 million battle in San Diego when there was no Democrat running for mayor. Very strange.
Right, very strange. And then, of course, Atkins, with her position as the speaker and all, you'd think that her money-raising ability would be enormous, and maybe his not so much.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, we'll be looking as we move on, of course, toward the mayor's race, and a lot more on that in the months to come. We're going to move on ourselves now. Methane gas has spewed for months from a broken well just north of Los Angeles before it became a big national story. There's a bit of good news. The massive plume of gas escaping each day has diminished, but that's little solace to the residents of the Porter Ranch area. Now, Ingrid, how bad is the gas flow now compared with its peak back in November?
I didn't do the math, but I think it's down by about 2/3. We're down to, I think, about 20,000 kilograms an hour. A total to date estimated of 5 billion cubic feet, I believe, which is a lot of natural gas to have lost. And they've been lessening the pressure underground, which is what gives the force to the gas to come up. And they're very close, I believe, with the relief well. So the relief well now is down as deep just about as the failed well, and now they need to penetrate that casing, find it exactly and penetrate it and be able to stop the flow. But one of the more recent developments that we found was that you have a main well casing made of steel, and then inside there you have a narrow tube. And the more typical, the more common practice is to force the gas down this narrow tube and bring the gas back up when you need it through that narrow tube. But we have it confirmed from the head of the State Oil and Gas Agency that this gas, on the day that this happened, was being injected under pressure through both its tube and its outer casing.
So it's a tube within a tube, and the best practice is to just do the smaller interior tube.
Right.
But they were doing both tubes.
Because it allows you to use the space in between to do other things that are safety measures. You can't do that if you're using the full diameter to pressurize, to force the gas underground. So we spoke with several well drilling experts in Texas, font of all things oil and gas related.
Right, absolutely.
And they told us, that's really not the best way to do things. And that's what was happening the day we found.
Now, is this legal? Does the state have a regulation forbidding this? So it is legal. They were not doing perhaps the best practice according to the experts you talked to, but it was legal.
And the state says it's re-examining that practice, particularly in older wells. And this well was originally drilled in 1953, so it certainly is an older well.
Now, also we had some action this week. The state Senate unanimously, I believe it was yesterday, said that they're not going to put any more gas into this particular field. They're going to examine the whole thing. I think the Assembly is going to follow suit on that. So late in the game, but it appears like there may be new regulations, new restrictions, and a whole new look at how they store this natural gas and how they bring it up, right?
They're not going to use this one particular well again, but this gas field is certainly not out of the picture by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I have recently heard the California Public Utilities Commission say that if they were to close this natural gas field, that they could not guarantee they would be able to deliver to people like you and me gas for our hot water and our heating.
So this field,
it's critical infrastructure. They say they are considering closing it, but a decision. To my knowledge, a decision has not been made to shut it down, and Southern California Gas says it's not considering closing it down.
And this is a long-used repository. It's not actually a gas well itself. It's where they store gas from elsewhere, right?
It's more than 150 wells, and yes, it's where they store. It's the largest place where they store gas for all Southern California customers. Well, including our power plants.
Right. So you raise a really interesting point. I mean, are we really willing to do some sort of restrictions and cut back on usage of energy if they were to have to take this thing offline? Would you think people would be willing to do that in the interest of safety? Or?
No, I mean,
it becomes a big political issue now.
Maybe. I mean, people want to use energy when they want to use it. They want the lights to come on. They want the stove to work. I mean, that's something that they sort of expect, right? One thing I am curious about, though, is, Separate, which is the parent company here, is one of two Fortune 500 companies in San Diego, obviously very important to the region's economy. What effect do you think this is going to have, this incident is going to have on Sempra?
We are just beginning to look at that and counting up the lawsuits and the numbers of plaintiffs, because some of the lawsuits have more than 100 plaintiffs. And the legal proceedings are really in their infancy. It hasn't even been decided before what judge this is all going to take place. But we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on that.
How many folks have been displaced up there in that particular Porter Ranch area where these wells are?
The numbers really vary tremendously. 3,000 families, we think, have temporarily sought relocation. Some say have been driven out of their homes. But I've seen some of the advocacy groups have numbers that are 3 times that high.
So I mean, it's a lot of folks in that.
Thousands of families is a lot of people.
And the equivalent here, it's hard to get your mind around just these quantities of gas, but you've turned it into an equivalent of millions of more cars on the road. And even at this lower rate where it's escaping, it's something. I think your story said over 3 million cars added to the roads in terms of pollution, right?
Yeah, I just did the up-to-date numbers, and it would be if you filled up and drove 70,000 tankfuls of gas, the equivalent climate emissions.
Okay. Now, the fixes, you said that they may be getting close. They're actually having to put a whole nother well in, which has taken months to drill down. How does it, give us the details on that?
Well, you have the one well that's over here, and then approximately 1,500 feet away, a safe distance, you have they drilled down again vertically. Now they've reached the same deep, deep depth. I think it's about 7,800 feet. It goes laterally. It's there. A couple days ago, it was within 200 feet. And then they have to pinpoint the 7-inch pipe, bore into it, and then force liquid down that will overcome the force of the gas coming up. Then they can permanently shut off that well.
And cap that. And so if they're at that depth, it would seem, as you say, they're getting close.
They're close. I've asked them could they tell me step by step what's happening now, and they can't.
Well, what about the danger?
Well, not right now.
What about the danger factor there? Is there still a risk of explosion or in tapping into this existing well? I mean, is this a real safety issue for the folks working there?
I don't know fully the answer to that. I don't believe there's a risk of explosion specifically regarded to getting into the original failed well. And we've heard very mixed things about the risk of explosion above. Planes, as you know, are not allowed to fly low over that site. But a representative of Southern California Gas said that it was his considered opinion that there's zero risk of explosion right now.
All right. And then, meantime, before we leave this topic, there are a lot of lawsuits already, and it's going to be very costly. And any idea? I mean, is there a class action from all the Porter Ranch residents there? Some state agencies have sued. What's the scope of the lawsuits?
Currently, I don't know exactly how many there are, but if you ask me that next week, I think I might. There's one that's called a mass tort action, and the attorneys for those are actually based in San Diego, and they say they have more clients than anyone else. And there are at least 20 suits, but I can't tell you exactly how many plaintiffs yet. I'm about to start counting them up.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll be doing a lot of follow-ups as we move forward on this story, and especially when they cap that well. All right, we will move on with ever-dwindling fish stock in the U.S. News of a massive fish farm off the San Diego coast should be welcome news indeed. Stories about fish farm plans by Hubbs-SeaWorld Research Institute have generally been positive, but Rye, your story reveals there's some clouds forming over the sunny aspects of this story. Why don't you start with the scope of this agriculture project proposed by Hubbs-SeaWorld?
So they're looking at, I think it's about 11 million pounds of fish off the coast a year. It's going to be a fish farm, sort of pens of fish about 5 miles off the coast. And they would put the fish out there and sort of pick them out and then sell them to the market.
But so a huge operation.
That's
one of the biggest in the country.
It would
right?
be, yes.
Yeah, and now Hubbs-SeaWorld already has an experimental fish farm near Carlsbad, and they've got problems there. What are they trying to breed, and what are some of the problems that you encountered in your reporting?
So they've been trying to breed white sea bass, and they've had a program for about 30 years, and Hubbs has been kind of in charge of it for the past 20. And it's a hatchery where they spawn white sea bass, and then they grow them into juvenile sea bass less than a foot long, and then their goal is to release these healthy sea bass, white sea bass, into the ocean, so that then we can catch them, or these sea bass will breed. And
they'll grow bigger, they'll breed, they'll become part of the
boost the population.
Whole population. And the population, as we said in the outset, has been dwindling. I mean, a variety of reasons, overfishing being one of the main ones. We really can use some more fish.
And there's a thought that the white sea bass population has actually been rebounding since this program started, though perhaps because of some banning of gill nets, which are these massive nets to catch just all kinds of fish at once, and then catch limits on the size of fish that you can get.
So the smaller breeding, and I guess we can call it experimental so far.
It is experimental,
because they haven't gone into the massive fish farm yet. Now, you're reporting in the interviews you did, you learned that they're really spawning some deformed fish. What are these problems that the experts are seeing?
So there's numerous problems there. There seem skeletal deformities. There are fish with bumps on their heads that they call horns. There are fish with sort of crooked spines. There's the way the water circulates through their hatchery facility, which is up in Carlsbad, causes the fish to have bubbles form in their eyes or to go blind entirely. And these are problems that would, particularly this blindness, would just not happen in the wild.
In your story, one top state fish expert, he's quoted as saying he accuses Hubbs of burying important facts of this program under a mountain of BS. What does he mean there?
Well, there's been a pretty good amount of positive attention for Hubbs-SeaWorld over the past years. They have a program to put white sea bass in classrooms. They've gotten pretty good attention for, restocking the ocean, is the way it's been advertised. And before now, the public really didn't know that there were a lot of problems with this program. They haven't been able to release as many fish as they had hoped. And some of the fish they're releasing die before they're released, or they may not be able to survive in the wild.
All right. Now, we're all consumers of fish. We eat fish. I mean, this would seem to be a serious thing where you're talking about, horned fish and blind fish and deformed fish. Who wants to eat those?
Yeah, so I'm mainly asking this question so I can say fish herpes on TV. But some of these fish have fish herpes, right? And yes.
There have been a couple of outbreaks of fish herpes. And because of this, when they detect this, they have to kill all the fish that have been identified to have herpes or around the fish that have herpes, and they've killed 100,000 or more fish.
But my serious question is, so what was interesting about your story is it's unclear really how common these sort of deformities are in these sort of fish farms. Can you maybe talk about that?
Yeah, there's problems at all hatcheries, are there not?
Yes. One of the interesting things about this is, well, there are two things. One, they're working with a species that's not really been worked with before. But the other thing is that because this is a state-funded program, we had access to documents, public records, that you wouldn't have about a private or commercial hatchery. So we're able to know a lot about this program that you're not able to know about commercial fish farms.
So speaking of public funding, how much funding has gone into it so far to try and get this thing up and running?
About $28 million since 1994.
And that's state funding. This is a state agency overseeing this now?
It's a mix of money from the State Department of Fish and Wildlife and from federal officials. A lot of it comes from sport fishing tags, sport fishing licenses.
Okay. Now, we all have a stake in getting these fish stocks back up because fish obviously is an important, healthy staple of our diet. I mean, everybody would want this thing to succeed. Plus, it would be a good commercial venture, and presumably increase some jobs here locally and create a new industry, right?
But I'm wondering, I mean, certainly there's so much precedent for restocking rivers and restocking lakes, but has anyone ever tried to restock an ocean fish before?
I think this is one of the major and first projects of its kind in the United States. I think there's some work that's been done abroad, some work I've heard about in Israel and in Japan and in Europe, I believe. But this is the only game in town like this on the West Coast.
All right. Ideally, what do they ultimately want to do with this fish farm? I mean, what would be the time frame? And you mentioned 11 million pounds as kind of the goal, but this will be a huge commercial operation, right?
So there's a difference between the state-funded program where you're seeing these deformities and the disease and the proposed project, which would be a commercial venture off the coast. The goal of the state-funded project was never really put in law. There was a kind of report on it in 2010, and the report came back and said, we don't really have goals for this program. Maybe we should come up with them. And now they're auditing the program to figure out if it's worked, if they want to keep doing it, if they should switch species.
Yeah. Okay. And so walk us through that process. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but they would take these small fish, they kind of pick them out one by one, decide which ones could survive in the wild, or, I mean, it sounds like a very intensive process.
So there's at the beginning, there's hundreds of millions of larvae which come from eggs, and then some number of those are just not going to survive. That's natural. And then they get to be a certain size, and they're preparing them to release them into the ocean. Sometimes they'll put them in pens in the ocean so they can grow a little larger, so they have a better chance of surviving in the wild where there's a lot of predators. And as they're releasing them from the hatchery facility, staff will pick them up, they'll sort of look at them, handle them, they'll actually knock them out with anesthesia, and then they'll sort of handle them, and they'll decide, oh, this is visibly deformed or not, and they'll, if they're okay, they'll let them keep going. If they're not okay, they'll put them in a bucket that kills them. It's full of a chemical that'll kill them. But one of the issues that's come up is they're supposed to be catching a lot of deformities there, but a state fish pathologist has found deformed fish in pens in the ocean, which in theory there shouldn't be as many as perhaps there are.
They shouldn't get there. Now, what's the response from officials at Hubbs-SeaWorld? What are they saying about all of this?
They say it's an experimental program. Nobody's done this before. Compare us to other people, and we think we can compare well where we can be compared, and that's kind of it.
Science.
How long has this program been going on, and what's the plan to get to the kind of massive fish farm stage?
So there's an audit of the state-funded program, and that'll be completed in 2017. There's a whole permitting process going on right now for the commercial fish farm off the coast, and that's any number of interested parties and regulatory agencies are going to be involved in that, and we'll see if it happens and see how long it takes.
Do you think that anything that there's going on here is that going to affect that permitting process offshore?
Well, the head of Hubbs-SeaWorld is the sort of interim CEO of the offshore fish farm that's proposed, Don Kent, and certainly something that raises questions about the ability of Hubbs-SeaWorld to do a good job would raise questions about his ability to oversee a commercial project.
Okay, a few seconds left. You tried to get an interview with the state fish pathologist, Marco Okahiro. You weren't able to do that, but you did have some of his reports and emails. They just don't want to talk about this.
Well, Fish and Wildlife was actually fairly generous with their time, and we got a lot of their documents, but they didn't want the guy to go on the record, and so they put me in touch with other people in the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but not him.
Well, it's a touchy thing, and I'm sure we'll be doing some follow-up, some more reporting as we go forward here, because it's such a public thing, as we said, with the deformed fish. It's not a phrase you want to hear if you're trying to sell fish. All right, well, that wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Liam Dillon of Voice of San Diego, Ingrid Lobet of iNewsSource, and Ry Ribard, also of Voice of San Diego. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.